welcome to the A. Marie Speaks podcast, where I'm talking about all things introspection, spirituality, and happiness. Thank you so much for joining me. Today's episode is going to be a brief introduction, mostly geared towards people who are newly waking up or might be new on this spiritual path and could be overwhelmed or confused by some of the topics or terminology that gets introduced when you start learning about things like soul evolution and ascension. I will be linking an article which I wrote a couple of weeks ago as a reference point to this podcast. Initially, I was going to just do an audio, a read of it, but when I went back and reread it, I realized it's actually a little bit advanced for a beginner. Some of the words I use and just the length of it and the deepness that I get into within the topics is definitely not a 101 kind of class, which is what I really want to give here. Because if you're tuning in today, this podcast is going to be embedded and available on my orientation page of my website, amariespeaks.com. I have areas on my site for people who are just waking up, and if they're confused or put off, or they just like to get a really simplified initial introduction, they can click on that space and it will bring them to this orientation page. And I'm going to be offering a couple of quick breakdowns on some initial terminology in these podcasts for people to listen to, and also take time to read the blogs and look at other people's information, articles, videos out there. I have tons of links to others for learning. So today, in this specific talk, we are going to cover sovereignty, consent, and polarization or service orientation. I'm going to briefly touch on boundaries and infringements, but those topics are really thick and encompass a lot of things both on their own. And so I'm going to break that information down and offer more direct tips and practices for personal discovery within things like setting your boundaries, both physical and energetical and spiritual, as well as infringements and what it means to deal with them. For today's episode, I want to keep it simple and focus firstly on what I feel is most foundational and really should be introductionary when you're coming into maturity, right? Maybe in your life you're experiencing a reality where you feel more spiritually curious, or you are feeling more mature and responsible in your life than you were before. You're seeing things more rationally maybe, or differently, coming to all these epiphanies and general understandings. Then if that sounds like you right now, chances are that you're waking up to your sovereignty. So when we talk about this word sovereignty, it can be a bit muddled or oversimplified, and I just want to initially speak about what I feel sovereignty is. Little disclaimer at the beginning here. Obviously, these are my opinions at this time, at the present moment, and I am not claiming that this is some kind of divine knowledge that I've come to or been given solely. I've certainly listened and worked through these ideas for a long time by listening to others' opinions, conversations, reading different materials. So I really encourage you to do the same. I'm really offering this information not as a soul guide, which you must follow step by step, but just as a point of reference to keep in mind and to allow ideas to percolate and come through when they make sense to you and when they resonate with you. And this allows you to bring in and incorporate different new ideas into maybe what your constructed perception of sovereignty or consent really was. Each and every one of us, this path is about creating our own definitions of these things. When we dig into these ideas and concepts and allow them space to ruminate and express what's really trying to come through, we find a more deeper sense of ourselves, who we really are within that. And that's really the name of the game here. That's really what the whole thing, life, this journey is all about. Defining and the intricacies within yourself and pulling out purposes and enlightenments. So when I give my definitions here, I just keep that all in mind and take it with a grain of salt. Take what feels good to you, and if things don't, you're free to discard them or ignore them or laugh them off. I encourage laughing them off just because nobody's trying to make you feel any certain way, and if you're feeling like ideas are being pushed upon you or you're being made to feel a certain way, that's really a great indication that you need to do some introspection into yourself, to ask yourself why you're scared to make your own decisions, because at the end of the day, that's where that line of thinking and that fear comes from. It comes from a fear of making up your own decision. Anyways, not to get sidetracked, I want to try to keep this short and simple to the point. So on sovereignty, let's get right into what I'm speaking on. It's a fundamental building block, I feel, in forming your energetic foundation as a infinite, eternal being. And that's really what it is. If you've ever heard of a soul, or you've been raised in a religious construct, these kinds of concepts are not new or too out there to you. To have this idea that each one of us is a unique soul or imprint with our own purpose. That's really what sovereignty is getting down to. And if you can pull back the initial, okay, that's it, let's just move on, I know what it means, and look at it a little deeper, you'll start to understand that sovereignty is dualistic. It has two sides to it, just like everything else. Shocker. There's a second side to the coin, and that happens because you're confirming that you're your own personal soul. You are seeing yourself as an individual essence of the Creator or of God, right? And in that, really, the base layer is an agreement, confirmation that your personal knowing of your own truth is direct contact to Source God. Your piece of creator inside of you is what guides you and what inspires you. And each of us has that, right? That's the kicker. That's the coin. The big picture is that if you want this for yourself, you want to acknowledge your sovereignty, you want to be in your own personal power and call your shots and really embody what you're meant to be. The secondary layer is that each and every one of us needs to be allowed to do that same thing. Each of us is our own personal soul. Just as you are free and special and unique, so is everyone else. Each being is a tiny piece of God's source energy. It can come as a bit of a twist in the road or a hard pill to swallow, the second half of this understanding of what it means to be sovereign. Because we've been so programmed in our cultures and in life and society that we have to take care of other people, that our family relies on us, that our job relies on us, society relies on us to do our little part. And I mean, yes, that's true, but the momentum and the intention of, or the origin of that momentum is what actually makes or breaks you. It can be a bit eye-opening to start to allow yourself to see this bigger picture. And it can be difficult too, because like I said, we're so conditioned to believe that we take care of others, that others, we need to be responsible for our families. That's more important than us. That seems to be what service to others is. And we'll get into that when we talk about polarization, but this is a classic inversion, a manipulation or distortion of service to others, because it's muddled and it is built on a lie. And I will get more into that when we dive into what polarization actually is. So I don't want to get too carried away with that and get away from the sovereignty aspect of it. But it's that catch-22. It's that, oh, well, I'm sovereign, so therefore everyone else is. It becomes very problematic if you're not ready to give up control and you're not ready to see this big picture, which is you hold no power over others, no more than they hold over you, right? At the end of the day, no one is inside your head. No one is in bed with you when you shut your eyes and you're ready to go to sleep. Your internal world, your perspective, your thoughts encompass only yourself. That circle is only you. And so in order to really respect and honor that, you have to first respect and honor that in others. So if you're ready to accept that conscious responsibility of sovereignty, well, then you're ready to mature and you're ready to really become an adult. And I believe that in that confirmation, in that space of sovereignty, is the only area where conscious or informed consent can really come out of. So now that I've kind of set the tone of what we're speaking about when we talk about sovereignty, I want to bring in this idea of consent. And like I just said, consent is going along with, agreeing, aligning with. So whenever you hear these words of alignment, resonance, we're talking about consenting or okaying or going along with something. So to have this underlying acceptance of sovereignty to operate your life from this space that I am sovereign, as well as every other human, or every other being, scrap human, because it's through all densities and life forms, the sovereignty happens. But the becoming conscious of it, seeing it for what it is, and working with it, is what grows consciousness and what expands it, and what brings us into these more developed levels and these more deeper densities, and into humanity and very complex levels of consciousness, like we are. But there's a spectrum, there's a variety. Never forget there's a growth happening that's much bigger than humanity and the human being. We tend to get very wrapped up in our human lives, because our human lives are the microcosm of the macro, and it's all we experience. So it can be easy to lose the big picture. So resonating and bringing in your sovereignty is really connecting also to that big picture. It's seeing yourself within the plan of God or Source or the Creator. Consent can happen when you're actually conscious about your experiences and your movement through life. You're conscious in your present moment. It can, in my personal opinion, it only can come at that point. And up until we have this complex conscious awareness, we are all consenting unconsciously and playing this static role in our lives, perhaps maybe even for lifetimes, if you see that as an option in your belief structures. It's possible that we go through lifetimes of this unconscious consenting, playing this sort of robotic role of base level consciousness, just following this programming. This is what I was talking about with the spectrum of densities, these lower density of consciousness. They can't see or understand that there's more out there. But no matter where you're at every level, there's always these chinks, bumps, disturbances that crop up every time. And it's sometimes called a catalyst. I refer to them a lot of times as a catalyst. I love that word because it just promotes such a reaction, or a chemical reaction visual when you say that. And it's important to see bumps in the roads, disturbances, upsets, problems as positive. This is what we call a growth mindset. We're seeing this take off in the mainstream even more, especially with children, with this growth mindset. It's okay to make mistakes, right? It's not a failure if you keep moving on. So that's the kind of aspect that I choose to see when I'm speaking about catalysts or problems. But like I'm saying, each being, they go through this sort of autopilot mode, their schedule, everything's the same, it's just monotone sort of, their regular homeostasis, and these chinks pop up, these disruptions. And it's at that time, when you see that pop up, if you just say, oh, that's weird, refocus on the schedule and get right back into it. If you are, oh, I don't know what that is, discard it, let it go, whoops, don't see that, keep it moving, just back to the normal. If that's your intention when these little catalysts pop up, then you're going to go right back to the normal, right? But if when these pop up, these signals, it registers with you, it brings in new information, and you say, hold up, what is that? Let me explore that. Let me go see what that is right now. Not tomorrow, not later, right this second. I'm going to go shine my light on this little bump and get it figured out right now. That's what I'm talking about with conscious consent. Every being goes through this foundational pattern, this cyclic smoothness or comfortability in which they will experience a chink in normality. It is at that time that they decide to either adapt and incorporate or dismiss and discard. That choice is exactly what consent is. That energetic intention is base level consent. You can speak yes or no after you've made that energetic choice. You can speak your choice. You can also lie about your choice. So that is a whole nother world that we can speak about later with this muddling of all of the chemistry and all the workings in your systems when you start to dig too deep into your gut reactions and you start to lie or cover up the way that you're really feeling. Everything gets very muddled at that point. But speaking before that or without that, that spot is the energetic exchange, is how the universe speaks with you. That's your first and your only contact with your world, with the universe, is that vibrational, emotional consent that you're dealing with when that catalyst originally bumps up, when you originally notice something. If you can realize that response, that energetic response to whether you're, oh, I don't want to see it, keep it moving, let's bring it back to what I'm focused on, or just totally divert attention, cognitive dissonance, right? You're not ready. Your consciousness is not expanded and ready to take that next step. And that's okay. That's fine where you're at. This is a whole other aspect of personal growth, is having patience with where you're at and acceptance for your capacity of understanding. That's why I say take it with a laugh. Laugh off some things that you don't quite understand yet. Don't feel like you have to get it or that you have to completely resonate 100% with somebody else. That's not the case. It's just about taking what looks good, analyzing it, looking at what looks bad to you, analyzing it, and making choices after that. It's like a slowing down and not rushing yourself into consenting to things that possibly don't feel right to you, or actually really don't feel right, but you feel pressured under time to push into them, and so you consent. It's a practice to learn this kind of discernment, and the more that you do it, the easier it will become. But this working is what consent means, and when I'm talking about informed consent, this is where I am personally coming from. One last piece I'd like to touch on is clearing distortions around consent. Now, clearing distortions is that active work of trying to work to understand things, equally analyzing the good with the bad, and really working to integrate and understand things, not rushing to conclusions that feel right or good just because of past assumptions. It's really about casting away, well, not really casting away, because, a loosening up of all your previous understandings and definitions of things, and allowing room for more other things to come in. And maybe they bump out or override some of the things you had before, and that's okay. That's how it's supposed to be. It's a fluid change. Everything is always changing. Clearing distortions around what you're consenting to, why, how, that's a lifelong practice that is different for every one of us. So if you bump into somebody who thinks that they are done with understanding consent or clearing distortions, and they're putting out a persona of 100% light love, quote unquote, or goodness, I would be highly skeptical of persons like that. And I've talked about this in other podcasts and other topics, but that is a huge red flag, and it should really be a warning to you to understand that that person has like a liar loop going on and is really mirroring out something that they are lacking on the inside, hoping that it's going to attract that back and fill the void of the lack. But it does not work like that. It does not work like that. So if you hear somebody who thinks that they're done with soul growth, or thinks that they have no distortions around what they believe is something, anything, even if it's not consent, if they think they have clarity 100% with zero distortions, I would be highly skeptical of that. And as a reminder, when you bump into people like that, that's a wonderful reminder from the universe to take a great look back at yourself and say, how am I actually promoting that out there? Am I actually giving off that vibe? And then go dig into yourself and clear those distortions within yourself, because you're only seeing them, you're only recognizing them and bumping into somebody who's showcasing them because at some level you have been seeking that and you have that within you. It's about releasing judgment on those things. It's about accepting them and working through them. They're shadow pieces of you, and they're just as valid as the other pieces. This is what we call shadow work, and it is that balancing, the working out of what your perception is. So yeah, that is mostly what I would like to just briefly talk about on the idea of consent. I'm going to link this article that I wrote, which goes a lot more in depth about some ideas around consent and setting up conscious consent. So if you're interested in that, if you feel ready to learn more, if you feel like you totally get what I'm saying and you want to get in touch with what you're consenting to, or maybe just dig deeper into this, check out the blog and you'll see some more pieces there on consent. But for now, I want to briefly touch on polarity or service orientation. This, like I said at the very beginning, is typically what we see as service to others or service to self. Now, it's no surprise if you take a look around that we live in a dualistic universe, right? The sun, the moon, light, dark, up and down, good and bad. So it's no surprise that us as beings are growing and evolving between two opposing or separate polarities, negative and positive. Now, typically, when we are speaking about service to self, that is the negative alignment or negative vibration. Service to others is a positive vibration. And you can see life as a kind of balancing act between maintaining a nice, whatever feels like homeostasis or nice comfortability to you at that moment, between these two charges of positive and negative. It could just be that this setup of polarities and is a construction of like third and fourth density, and maybe it's not applicable in higher densities, but for now and for understanding in this lifetime where we're most certainly in that 3D, 4D realm, understanding the charge you're collecting is crucial. This comes back to the initial idea of sovereignty, that we talked about at the very beginning. Polarization, or your orientation, stems from your sovereignty. If you choose to see others as God's source, a piece of the Creator, a unique soul, a seed planted by God on their own, for their own purpose, their own intentions and goals, then you respect other people just as you respect yourself. On the negative, inverted side of that, if you choose to see yourself as all there is and the most important thing, you can still consider yourself, or you still do consider yourself a being of God or a creator, active participant in the universe here. But that alignment or directionality isn't necessarily concerned about the other out there, because their self, their survival comes first before anything else. So that idea of sovereignty gets a little twisted to a person who's heavily negatively aligned, because they miss the whole second side of the coin that we talked about at the beginning. They refuse to acknowledge that both sides are as important and as weighted, and that they're sides of the same coin initially or originally. So spending time to understand the concepts and perspectives, the differences, without judgment and calling one quote unquote good or evil, it opens up understanding for you. And so you don't sit there criticizing maybe those negative parts of yourself. You can actually see them for what they are and work through them, which again is the point of the entire thing. So I want to give just a brief description of what positive polarization means, and then I'll give a brief description from my opinion of the negative polarization. Keep in mind, I'm going to use some words and visualizations or explanations that might seem a little out there or a little too deep, but even for beginners, I really feel like hearing this explanations in this way, it sets a better tone for a deeper understanding when you're ready. So again, don't feel like you have to 100% hear and understand everything that I'm giving as these definitions. Just keep your eyes and mind open and allow possibilities to come in, and to maybe give it some space and maybe work into what you have as like a preconceived understanding of the positive and negative. Oh, and actually, what I would love to say briefly and quickly on this note of positive and negative, good versus evil, sometimes we get this pigeonholed view that God and Satan are something that works similar and are on the scope of the spectrum. And I mean, everyone's welcome to their own opinion, but in my opinion, and many ancient cultures over time, and many different religions and ideologies, dogmas, they all come back to this same knowing, the oneness, right? And that bigger view of the oneness. Now, when some people talk about God and the devil, good versus evil, they see that like a yin-yang, where God is the light and the devil is the dark, and they're battling back and forth. But that view, like I said, is very confined and boxed in and pigeonholed. And in fact, if you as a kid zoom out and see that God, source energy, the creator of all, the infinite intelligence, is the circle which encompasses that yin-yang sign, the dark and the light. It's a container for both aspects to do the work. And therefore, it's separate or conditionary. It's something outside of that spectrum of good and light, right? It can't be just light if it encompasses both. Now, if this is something that's hard for you to understand, don't feel alone. This took me years to feel comfortable in this type of knowing and understanding what oneness means. It can take lifetimes for some people, myself included. I'm sure I've spent many years and lives ruminating on these topics. I have been given a beautiful metaphor that I want to insert quickly here before I go into my definitions of positive and negative polarity. And that is a visualization of you, your human body, the whole of you. In your life, you go about a daily life, you have a conscious setting that you work on, right? Now think about a cell inside of your body. How small and tiny compared to your body it is. It's microscopic, right? Yet the cell has a function, a purpose, a job. It has its own programming every moment. It's running through, operating, following, managing. It is made up of only materials, matter, molecules, and chemicals of your whole human body. Not 1 inch of that, or nanometer, of that cell is made up of anything that is not of your human body, right? Yet, if you can imagine what consciousness at that cell level looks like, can it ever even comprehend what it is to be a human in the whole body and your level of consciousness? No. It can't, right? So when we're talking, and also deeper to that still, one last thing is place yourself at that cell level consciousness and really feel it and try to understand how you would ever even comprehend what a body is, what you are as a human. You might, as that cell, have an idea or have some sort of sense, but you never could comprehend the complexity that all of you as a human, right? So when we're trying to understand what God source, the ultimate outside container of this universal experience is, keep that cell to human ratio of consciousness, of beingness, of matter, transitory growth in mind. Because it really, when I got that message, it really helped me to work out my place in the big picture and really understand this fractalization of as above, so below. Because that esoteric ancient knowledge, it's just a filter. It's a beautiful filter that you place on every aspect that you could ever imagine and say, as above, so below. Because everything is interconnected. It's very beautiful when you can really grasp even just a glimpse, because who could ever get the big picture as a human? We can't. I would never try to express that I've gotten that kind of view. But to even get a pinch, get a little taste of it, it's miraculous. And it really does make the suffering, the pain, all the catalysts, this whole uncomfortability of 340 life, bearable to me, to get back into that knowingness. And that's tapping back into my sovereignty. And that well of unconditional love that I was trying to explain at the beginning. So with that said, I am going to now hop into this brief explanations of positive and versus negative polarity or directionality, orientation, all those kinds of words are words that we're using to describe this collection of charge, energetic charge. So a positive polarization is seen as an inward and upward spiral of spiritual growth. We characterize it by positivity. The torus of energy in the center of a being who is flowing positively or charged positively, the torus flows outward from this unconditional love well. It seeks to serve others because it recognizes that all are one and all have chosen to be sovereign, right? That outward pouring of energy and love serves others first, not because it's the right thing to do or because it views others as weaker or thinks that others need it more than them. That this flow is of positivity is never and can never become a burden when you truly understand it and tap into it, that is. That inner well of unconditional love will flow freely when you release it. You become empowered and energy just springs forth right out of it. And when catalysts do come up, because they always come up, if your torus is getting stagnated, it's slowing down, others out there who you have served will refresh and energize that energetic flow for you on the back end and send it back to you. Excuse me. To help recharge you because they're seeking to serve others as well. And so their energy that you've already connected with can replenish yours because you are aligned energetically. Now, in contrast, we have negative polarity. And negative polarity is characterized by an inward and downward spiral of spiritual growth. The negative torus of energy flow is pulling from the external wells of unconditional love and bringing it inwards. It is flowing outwards and inwards and down. It seeks to fill its internal love well. There's multiple reasons for this. It's bypassing, it's insecurities, it's refusing to acknowledge the well is there, it's believing the lie that your well is limited and there's an end to it, and so if you use some of it, you're losing it. That's a huge misconception and inversion that is, a tactic to keep people in a negative polarization. Again, it's that tapping into sovereignty and understanding how it works that can deviate you and open up your understanding so that you're not limited by scarcity, thinking that your energy and your energetic well has an end to it. But again, the negative polarity is refusing or ignoring, they're bypassing that. And so instead, they think they need to fill that well. their orientation serves self first because it sees it as a necessity. It thinks it needs that to survive. It truly believes that it must fill its well up to the top to even be able to be anything, because it's stunted its understanding that the abundance comes from the well, which springs up and out. It's this deflection or inversion of understanding energetics that keeps the negative path strong and keeps it valid. It's this internal directionality of negativity requiring more resources that is kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy when you're stuck in that negative perspective, that you really can get a lot of confirmation that yes, resources are limited, because that's what the place that you're choosing to come from. And so of course they seek to fill their well because they believe that resources are limited. Unfortunately, this seeking of resources, the bringing them in, the filling up that well, exhausts pieces of their soul in doing that. But again, they're ignoring this or unable to see it. It's, on a simple term, a negative charge accrues in energetic debt, right? Because not only do you need to spend your energy, some of your well, right? You have to use a little bit to entice others out there to get it in. And you also need to spend that energy to work the energy in and send it back out. And so it's the total opposite. And I hope I'm giving good visualizations of this. It's the total opposite mechanism of an internal rising up, pulling from source consciousness and internal love that comes out on a positive polarization. It's important to understand where both intentions and both perspectives come from, so that you can really identify them for yourself and start to understand when you're in an alignment or you're in a certain directionality. And then you can go through these steps with yourself and identify them and work through them and try to bring balance into that alignment. Another aspect I want to briefly touch on is this concept of oneness. When you come into more complex consciousness, you start to really get confirmation that oneness is real, because you have one experience. You're in one body your whole time. And so this oneness gets confirmed to us. Now, services, orientations, see this oneness from different perspectives. So a service to self recognizes that all are one, but their view is inverted compared to the view of positive orientation. Because, as I spoke about earlier, positive orientation seeks to serve others because it sees them as a valid, valuable, source, sovereign being. And because they love themselves and have this unconditional love for source and themselves, it's just totally natural to have it for other beings. But service to self instead sees everyone as a resource for their oneness, as a commodity for their show, as something that, because it's the same as them and they're also God, that all these are for their use. Out there is everything is for them to use, for their benefit, right? They see others as, oh, well, if you're an extension of me, then you must bow down to my will. I know what's right because you're an extension of me, and I'm the only one having my experience personally. So therefore, I must be the one. I must know the right for all those out there. I must be better and higher than all those out there because I'm having my one personal experience. So there's a difference in perspectives of the oneness when we're looking at polarizations. And this is a big determinality for you to try to scope where you're at, because a negative orientation creator being believes itself to be above other parts, and it takes the truth of sovereignty and twists it. It replaces it with another quote-unquote truth. It is truth, but it's inverted. This is a secret understanding to see how shadow plays with us by twisting and inverting something, saying, oh, you think you know it by this way? Let's look at it this way. And the negative polarity here is twisting the oneness. And so it rings true still. It's strange how one can invert truth, because you're mixing lie with truth, but the underlying truth is still there. And so this is how people get fooled, because the lies are coding around the truth, the underlying sovereign truth. The shadow takes and says, oh, just like it took, and it changes oneness into a negative twist. It takes sovereignty and turns it to servitude. And because it believes that its one experience is greater than others, this idea of servitude comes into play, that there is a higher being and it's created you, and because it's created you, it knows better than you. It's above you, and I am in direct connection with this, and therefore I know what is best for all of you. It's subtle. It's so subtle, and yet that intention, that division of initial intention, is where that conscious choice point is made at. This is where you consent and you polarize your charge, either positive or negative. Which one sounds more true to you? You know? Neither is good or bad, honestly. It's okay to have conflicting feelings on these things. It's about working through them for yourself, not for others. That's a whole other topic that we can get onto when we talk about boundaries and infringements. And that is understanding this other scope of sovereignty that comes along with making up your own mind, the right to make up your own mind and to leave others to do the same. Just like people have a right to be themselves, to follow their purpose, to be held accountable for things, they have a right to make their own mind up and have their own opinion, just like you do. If you choose positive polarity, again, if you choose negative polarity, this is where infringements and consent is wishy-washy, because different strokes for different folks, right? As Max Egan, one of my favorite speakers, says, everything is personal and individual, and there is a myriad of, this is why it's a spectrum. And it takes time and lifetimes of you to gather this polarity, to get a charge, to be strong enough in a sovereign being to choose your path. Because ultimately, that's what this 3D, 4D life is really about, is about making that choice. Whether it is positive or negative, just make the choice. You have to. Because when you stagnate and you sit on the fence of your polarity, you can never grow in your soul's evolution. You're unable to gain momentum because you're refusing to choose a direction, right? If you think about it very simply, how can you, on a linear, logical view of this, how could you ever get anywhere if you stand at a fork in the road? making pros and cons lists. Yes, maybe you can envision where each road goes, and they're all the well to you. Please do that before you make your choice. But you need to make your choice, because is your soul going to sit at that fork in the road? Yes, it is. This is another big picture kind of thing that comes in when we talk about polarization. We talk about humanity and ascension, because each individual is on this soul growth path of ascension, just as humanity as a collective is as well. And we can't make any big strides when we're standing and refusing to make choices. So understanding, that it's a spectrum and that nothing is set in stone, and you're free to make these choices, because the fork in the road is actually not two separate roads which lead in these totally different directions. And you've got to make a choice, because one goes this way, the other goes that way. It's like it's a double helix. It's a spiral. This is why we say it's an inward, upward spiral, or a downward, outward. An inward, downward, or an outward, upward, excuse me. Getting excited in my explanation here, but I love that visualization also of a double helix in DNA and these two ladders of choice points which wrap around each other. And yes, they do create this fork in the road, which at the time you might think is like they're taking you in these two totally opposite directions where you'll never be able to hop back onto the other if you make this choice. But they go out only so far, yet to come back in, to cross at another point, which is quite similar. And you have another chance at whatever choice point that is. And each lesson, each karmatic thing that you face in your life ebb and flows like this weaving ladder of negative and positive, a double helix, because it spirals as well. It's a circling back to the same but different. Are you ready to make a different choice or not? Do you see things differently this time or not? That's what it's all about. And so when we're talking about making these choice points, it's not the end-all be-all, because this is not linear. That's another thing that most people who are new to this are really going to have to work at understanding. This thing is not linear. There's no end point. It's an eternal balancing, which can be frustrating all on its own, but it's very beautiful at the same time. So now that I've explained slightly a bit about polarization and just given you a beginning point to start off with, so that's what I will speak on. Just as a starter, I feel like I've gone quite a while. So if you have stayed to listen to the whole thing, I thank you very much. I hope you've gotten more than enough to think about on just these beginning topics of sovereignty and consent and polarization. I hope when you hear these things that they won't confuse you as much, or maybe they confuse you more now. And that's okay too. Take time, please, on your own to ruminate and let these things sink in and determine what they mean for you. If you're aligning with what I'm saying, if I've sparked curiosity, or if you totally disagree with me, I would love to hear about it. I would not be offended in the least. If you don't align with what I'm saying, or you happen to see services in a different way, or your definition of sovereignty is different, leave a reply below. I'd love to hear it, and I thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a blessed day. And I hope you'll join in for part 2, where I will get more in depth into infringements and boundaries and how to set your boundaries. So be sure to check that one out as well. And thanks so much for listening.